Just click the record button. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the March PAPREN Parks and Green Space Work Group meeting. Pull up my slides here quick for everybody. Alrighty, so welcome again. If you haven't had the chance again, go ahead and throw your name, affiliation, and any special interest into the chat there so we can see who is here and just kind of see if anyone's new, stuff like that. I want to do a quick introduction of our co-chairs here. I didn't see Rich join. Is Rich on? Dr. Rich Christiana from Appalachian State yet?
I haven't seen him yet. I thought he was going to be here. Anyway, I'll say hello for everybody.
Okay.
Sandy today. Sandy Slater from Concordia, Rich Christiana from Appalachian State, and myself, Jenna Gusset from Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine in New Orleans. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you, everybody. So just a quick agenda for you today. We're going to start with our presentation from Teresa and Dianne, and then we'll do a quick Q&A with them if there's time after that. Then we'll get some quick project updates. We'll have an open mic, including a recap of ALC. So everybody who was there, you'll get to see some pictures. Or if you weren't there, you'll get to see some pictures. And then just next meetings and upcoming presentations for PAPREN and this work group. So I would like to introduce our speakers here. So we have, I'm going to start, I put them in a different order than I have their intros. So I'm going to start with Dianne. So Dianne is the NRPA's Director of Evaluation, and Dianne oversees evaluation activities and strategies at NRPA. She's dedicated to developing training and resources for parks and recreational professionals that will assist with effective, low-cost evaluation efforts in the field. Dianne has over 17 years of research and/or evaluation experience and leadership and additional experience in several diverse fields. She holds undergraduate degrees from Clarkson University and Georgia Institute of Technology, and she earned her PhD at Carnegie Mellon University. I knew I was going to stumble on that, but I was trying. And then Teresa is our other speaker. They're going to do a combined one here. She's the Senior Program Manager at NRPA, and she joined in 2020 to develop and advance NRPA's youth sports strategy, which is grounded in NRPA's vision that all kids should have access to high quality opportunity for sports. Teresa currently oversees a portfolio of grants and initiatives designed to position parks and recreational professionals as catalysts for youth sports equity, and recently her work has expanded to focus on physical activity in parks broadly. Before joining NRPA, Teresa forged partnerships at the community level to support increasing access to STEM education for youth of color and youth living in low-income households. She truly is a champion for health equity, and Teresa is passionate about improving the communities where people live, learn, work, and play. 1 second, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'll go ahead and bring up theirs. I'll go ahead and pass it on over to them.
Fabulous. Thank you, Andy, and thanks to the group for having us. Dianne and I are so excited to be connected with y'all to talk about the Active Parks Implementation Guide. So I might just jump us into the next slide, and Andy, I really appreciate you driving as well. You're the best. Before we went into the Active Parks resource and how it was developed and what's included in there, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background about the National Recreation and Park Association, so who we are and what we're trying to accomplish if folks aren't familiar. So we are a national nonprofit that represents all local park and recreation systems across the country. So think your city, your county, your regional park system. And then we're also working really closely with those folks who manage those spaces. So we refer to them as our park and recreation professionals. As you can see on the slide here, this is NRPA's vision statement. So our vision is that we seek a future where the full power of parks and recreation is widely recognized for creating a better world for everyone, because everyone deserves a great park. We'll jump into our next slide. So NRPA has 3 pillars, which we've listed on the slide here, but essentially these 3 pillars represent those 3 areas where we feel like parks and recreation can really have the greatest impact in communities. So the first, and I'm going to go a little bit out of order here, our first pillar is equity. So Equity is at the center of everything that we do at NRPA. We're committed to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, along with justice internally and in the field with our park and recreation professionals. Also, just wanted to note, we have a pillar that's focused on health and wellness. So when we're talking about our health and wellness pillar, really thinking about advancing community health and well-being through the power of parks and recreation. Our last pillar on the slide here is conservation, so focused on creating more resilient communities through climate-ready parks that are able to withstand and mitigate against the impact of climate change. And for this pillar and this body of work, we're also focused on fostering that next generation of environmental stewards. On our next slide, awesome, Andy, you're reading my mind, thank you. Just wanted to note how at NRPA, we really view parks and recreation as essential. So essential to community health and well-being, essential to connecting community members to those programs and services that help improve health outcomes and improve the quality of life. So as you can see on the slide here, and I think this group already knows, the benefits of living near parks and using parks is really enormous. So evidence shows that people who live near parks and who are using parks are 3 times more likely to achieve the recommended levels of physical activity than non-park users. This group also experiences improved cognitive performance and a reduction in illnesses, things like depression, attention deficit disorders, or Alzheimer's. And also just wanted to note that folks who are living near and using parks are experiencing improved physical health and mental health and reduced risk of chronic disease. So likely unsurprising to this group on the call, but just wanted to ground us in the benefits of having access to park and using those amenities. So on our next slide, despite those benefits that I was just going through, inequities and gaps still exist in terms of who is accessing park spaces. So just to put it in perspective, I've got on the slide here, in the United States, about 100 million people, and that is roughly 30% of the population, lack access to a park that is high quality and that is close to home. So I just want to pause. 30% of the population, that is a huge number of people that we're talking about here. And so I also wanted to note that park equity in the US can be traced back to a history of unfair practices and policies. So I wanted to make sure that we're naming systemic racism and the impact that those practices and policies have had on folks accessing and benefiting from park and recreation spaces. So this inequitable distribution of park spaces and being able to access these amenities, it means that certain populations face additional barriers to benefiting from parks and rec. So thinking about our communities of color or low-income communities, individuals with disabilities, or LGBTQ plus communities. What's more, in addition to that access issue that I was just speaking about, we also see some existing park spaces that don't get as much usage as they should or as we would hope. And that could be for a couple different reasons. So those spaces may not be safe or inclusive, accessible or welcoming. Those spaces might not have been created in partnership with the community, or they might not be programmed in partnership with the community. So there could be a lack of that community-centric focus. Also just wanted to note, and I was just touching on this, that sometimes park spaces aren't being activated. That's a term that we use at NRPA to just say, layered in with programming or public awareness to actually be drawing people into parks or trails to be using those spaces. And so looking on the bright side, the resource that Dianne and I are here to talk to y'all about today is designed to support professionals in tackling those issues. So it's focused on increasing equitable access to park and recreation amenities like parks, trails, and greenways. And this resource is also focused on increasing the use of those spaces or activating those spaces specifically for physical activity. So on our next slide, I know the moment you've all been waiting for is for us to actually start talking about this resource. I promise that's where we're going. And I know this slide looks a little crazy, but bear with me, it'll make sense in a moment. So before I dive into the Active Parks Guide, I just wanted to speak to where this resource came from. So in 2021, the Community Preventative Services Task Force, I always mess that up, so I'm stoked that I nailed that, which is an organization formed by HHS. They released this guidance that recommended that both park and recreation and public health professionals combine these two things to increase physical activity in park spaces. So looking at the left hand of our slide here, the first piece of the equation is combining park, trail, and greenway infrastructure improvements. So thinking about building a new park, trail, or greenway, or your infrastructure improvement could be referring to making some kind of update or refinement to an existing amenity. So infrastructure improvement is our bucket on the left-hand side of our equation here. But you need to combine that with something else in order to increase physical activity in these amenities. So very broad. In the recommendation, these are just called additional activities. But what does that mean? So thinking about different activities that could be access enhancement or community engagement activities, public awareness activities, or structured programming as sort of this layering in effect to be increasing the use of a park, a trail, or a greenway for physical activity. So as I teed up, and as you can see on the slide, there's a big plus sign in the middle. We think about the technical recommendation as this equation. So you've got to have your infrastructure improvement, and you've got to combine that with your additional activities in order to actually see some sort of change in usage of a space for physical activity. And so I will just note that in the recommendation that came out from the Community Preventative Services Task Force, there was not enough evidence to support that just putting in place some kind of infrastructure improvement, so a new park or some kind of upgrade to amenities, that alone didn't have significant evidence to be increasing physical activity. So really, we're focused on this combination effect to drive real impact. And so I also wanted to note at NRPA, we found this recommendation particularly exciting because it felt like an endorsement from public health to actually start closing the park equity gap. So then following the release of this recommendation that we're looking at on this slide, that's when NRPA came into the picture. So the guidance was already out. And so NRPA partnered with CDC's DNPAO to take this technical recommendation and to actually break it down into language and an implementation guide that professionals in the field can actually use to put this guidance into practice. So really focusing on, we've got this research that says doing these things, it leads to increased physical activity, but how do we get there? What does that look like? Where do we start? And so that's how the implementation guide came to be. That's exactly what it is. It's really bringing those instructions for how to make this recommendation a reality in your parks, trails, and greenways. So on the next slide, we go into a bit more detail around what is included in the guide. And so as you've heard me say a couple times now, the goal of the guide is really supporting park and recreation and public health professionals to advance that recommendation that we were reviewing on the last slide. And so just to go into broadly what's included in the guide, just like I've sort of done with this group, first we start with, we call it a translation of that really technical language from the task force. And so it dives into those gaps in park access, reiterating how to close those gaps. It's really critical to be engaging those people and those communities who have traditionally lacked access. So really making those folks a critical part of your physical activity project. The guide also goes into a very granular step-by-step process for how to implement that guidance that we were talking about before. So things like, how do I select my infrastructure improvement? How do I know that I should be building a new park versus improving this park that we've already got built that no one seems to be using? Things also like how to engage the community in your infrastructure project. There's a lot of great content in there on community engagement and how to authentically engage folks in the community. There's also guidance around how to select those additional activities that we were talking about and how to implement those in tandem with your infrastructure improvement. And then most importantly, I just wanted to note, and this piece is woven throughout the guide, I would say, but there's a lot of content on how to be centering equity throughout each stage of the process in your physical activity project. Lastly, the guide does include a couple of case studies from communities that have implemented projects that are in alignment with the recommendation, just to give y'all some concrete examples. I will say that these are projects that NRPA had worked on sort of before or simultaneous to when that research was coming out. So they're not a perfect fit, but they do a nice job of illustrating how you could take an infrastructure improvement and layer in those additional activities to increase physical activity. So just wanted to note that and note that we're excited for folks to actually start using the guide so we can be building up that list of case studies as well. And so again, on our next slide here, we'll keep going a little bit more granular just so you have a sense of what's included. I know I went over broadly what we've got in the guide, but this graphic illustrates sort of each of those sections under how to implement your project. And so I just wanted to note what's in there for you all. So first, touching on how to identify your project team in this work, or figuring out who your partners are in this work. And I just wanted to note, and we kicked off the guide with this section because folks can't be doing this work alone. And I think the point that we really want to note here is that it's got to be a partnership between public health and between Parks and Recreation, which is another reason that we were so excited about this guidance, to really encourage folks and support them as they're building those partnerships and relationships to advance health outcomes in communities. There's also some content around assessments and evaluation. So this is sort of pre-figuring out what your project may be. So it can help guide you in identifying those gaps or assets that you need to be introducing into your park system. So really taking a data-driven approach to actually figuring out, we want to park here, or we want to make improvements here. So just wanted to note, I think another key piece that you've heard me say a few times is that community engagement is really important in this planning phase. It is also one of those additional activities that you can be layering in to activate the space. So community engagement is sort of, it's in there for sort of the pre-project inputs, and then also it's layered in as an additional activity. So after sort of those planning sections, you get through those, you've got your project team, you've got your partners, and you've engaged the community, and you've got some data around, what's our infrastructure improvement, and here are some of these additional activities we want to move forward. Then you can start actually pulling together your action plan. And so I would just note, we sometimes see that happening in the reverse order. So we see agencies or folks saying, I feel like we need to park here, and then inviting the community to be a part of that process and to be providing some input. But we want to make sure that the community is really involved from that first moment of deciding that there's even going to be a project in the first place, so that it is community-centric and community-driven, because that will lead to the highest usage of the new infrastructure or programming or whatever the thing may be. Also, just wanted to go back to evaluation again. So as folks are implementing these projects, which we know take some time, we just wanted to reiterate that it's important to be continually evaluating how things are going. So I'm not going to steal a show from Dianne, but if there are questions around evaluation, she is the expert in that realm, but wanted to make sure that folks had tools and resources to be continually building this evaluation into the process. And then our last section here on the top right, we also wanted folks to be thinking through, how do we sustain the long-term impact of this project? So things like a maintenance plan to make sure that you're budgeting to keep your new infrastructure up to code, or a community engagement plan to make sure that this new amenity or new park, trail, or greenway is really meeting the needs of community, and that you're programming it with things that they're actually interested in and want to do. So I know that's a lot of information about the guide, how it was created, where it came from. And so while folks are digesting a little bit of that information, Dianne, I'm going to let you jump in just to talk about how we leveraged our expert review process to get some input on the guide and publish our final edition. So I'm going to pause and let Dianne jump in.
Hey, thanks, Teresa. Just to follow up a little bit with the evaluation sections in the guide as well. We included information on evaluating safety condition and maintenance, programming and activation, monitoring use and activity, and assessing community engagement efforts, along with, as with every other section, we included a number of additional resources that readers could access to get more information in those areas. So next slide, please. So of course, after our group finished the draft of the implementation guide, we wanted to involve experts to review the document and give us all kinds of feedback in different areas. We reached out to public health and park and recreation professionals both. And I will say that the sample of 8 people, many of them had experience in both to a different extent. So we had really a very rich list of credentials for the people who did our expert review. The interviews are about 60 to 90 minutes, and we did offer a small stipend if they wanted to take advantage of that for participating. Next slide, please. So we asked a number of questions, but the 4 probably main areas that we asked questions in are listed here. We asked about language, we asked some feedback on the title, the content that was included in the document throughout, and then the resources that were provided for the different areas. Now for language, we really wanted feedback on the reading level. We wanted to know that it would make sense not only to the target audience, but also to, let's take it to an 8th grade level so that, you know, it's really accessible to most people who are working there out in the field and community members. We also wanted them to talk about any areas that they felt could be reviewed for clarity and understanding, eliminating any kind of obscure jargon, that type of thing. We then showed them the recommendation language to get their feedback. We checked for understanding overall and for a couple of terms that were used throughout the document, such as intervention, which we'll get to in a minute. We showed them some proposed wording for the recommendation, alternative wording for the recommendation. And we asked them to identify which were the clearest, easiest to read, easiest to understand, which one's the most powerful, and any other terms or words that they recommend using in the recommendation to improve clarity. Then we asked them to consider the audience, the content, and the evidence as elements of the recommendation. And we asked them, okay, what's the most important of those 3 to highlight in the recommendation if we're going to have to highlight one of them. For the title, we essentially gave them a number of listed suggestions for titles and asked them to pick out the ones that they preferred and asked them why. They also were able to give us their own suggestions if they preferred. For content, we wanted to ask them, you know, does the content meet the stated objective? And the stated objective was professionals will increase their knowledge of the steps needed to achieve the community guide recommendations, which aim to equitably increase access to and use of parks, trails, and greenways for safe physical activity. We want to make sure that the document was actually meeting that objective, obviously. In section 2 of the guide, we asked if all these sections provided useful steps. You know, were they reading the paragraphs that we provided and not thinking that those would be steps that somebody could follow? And if they were not useful, how could they be improved? We wanted to find out if any topics were missing. Is there anything that we really should include in this document that we hadn't thought of? And then more importantly, we wanted to make sure that equity was centered throughout. If there were sections where equity was not centered, how could we do better at that? And then finally, resources. We have resources, as I mentioned, at the end of every section. And so we asked them to review the resources for the sections and suggest any additional resources they want us to provide, or indicate any that we had provided that they felt were not applicable to that particular section. And of course, they were able to provide general thoughts, and we had some other questions in there as well, but these were the 4 main topics of inquiry. Next slide, please. So after we put all of the suggestions together and we got a robust set of information, I think it ended up being a 23-page document, including all of the feedback and quotations and everything like that. But these were really the key findings that we took away from the expert review. The experts felt that the language was understandable for the target audience. They felt that including the definitions throughout was definitely helpful for those with less exposure or experience in particular areas. They asked for wording to clarify that activating a park should be contextually defined by the community. So instead of just referring to activation, really emphasizing that the community needed to be involved in how the parks were activated. They suggested this was one of the ones that we were really hoping to get some feedback in. They suggested removing the word intervention. Just about all of the participants felt that it was not a park and recreation word. It was more of a public health word. And one participant said that it implied that something was wrong that needs to be fixed. And that was not necessarily our intention. So we, had to go back to the drawing board with intervention and use a different word for that. They also selected the shortest, most direct, action-oriented recommendation wording for the recommendation wording out of the options we selected for them. They suggested increasing our talk about ADA accessibility, especially in the infrastructure section. And then most agreed that the content was most appropriate. I'm sorry, that content was the most important descriptive text to include over evidence and audience when writing the recommendation. Next slide, please. Just a couple more. The panel suggested numerous wording edits throughout for enhancing content and a more robust treatment of equity, which was super helpful. They gave us very pinpointed suggested edits. They suggested a few more resources to consider, but they liked the ones that we had, didn't suggest removing any. They chose the most popular title, which was Active Parks. And as you know, that is part of our title. And finally, they recommended promoting the guide to other sectors, partners, and communities that may benefit from its content. And they came up with an amazingly detailed list of other types of sectors and partners that may benefit from the content, which was really interesting. Overall, the expert review, I believe, was extremely helpful to all of us in trying to, really hone in on the most important aspects of the implementation guide. Next slide, please. I believe, Teresa, you're going to go over these case studies, right?
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in with one illustration of how an agency has leveraged this guidance from the task force to implement an infrastructure improvement. I almost said intervention there, since Dianne, you were just talking about that. Took a long time to say improvement, not intervention, and layer it in with those additional activities to increase usage of a space for safe physical activities. So we're looking at an example here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so in 2021, this park reopened after undergoing some renovation that included the installation of wayfinding signage. They built an outdoor classroom, and then they also installed a natural playscape, which is the one shown in this photo. This project, it's sort of spurred off of the fact that Grand Rapids Parks and Recreation noticed that this really lovely park space was pretty underutilized. And so before deciding what to do with the space or what to install to increase usage and to get folks out there, Grand Rapids, as we were talking about, did a really nice job of inviting the community to the table to really drive the project and to tell the city what they wanted in the park to make it a really nice amenity. So just wanted to note that community engagement piece that's informing the process for picking the infrastructure and picking the additional activities. So in these community meetings that Grand Rapids hosted, they heard that the community, they wanted this space to be a place for more connection to nature. And they got pretty specific in their feedback. They wanted to see that done with natural materials. So that's how we wound up with this lovely natural playscape here, and also the outdoor classroom. So just noting that each of those would be an example of our infrastructure improvement. But this group knows that infrastructure alone, it's not enough. So Grand Rapids also activated this space with a couple additional activities. So they installed that wayfinding signage that I mentioned, and then they also built some connectivity between this park and another local trail. So making sure that that trail system was really interconnected, because they had heard that folks using this other trail had never come to Kenosha Park before, and likewise. So really opening up that path for folks to explore more of those local amenities and get connected to nature. And so I'll also note that in addition to that connectivity and wayfinding signage, which falls under our access enhancements, Grand Rapids also programmed this space in partnership with a school it's right next door to the park. And so they worked with teachers to figure out what kids may want. So leveraging that in the outdoor classroom. So like I said, layering in these access enhancements and programming onto those infrastructure improvements. And so Grand Rapids was pretty excited to see the space quickly reinvigorated with new park users. Like I said, folks coming from that other trail, folks coming from the school, teachers and students. And so thanks to these improvements, Grand Rapids, they're continually engaging with the community around how to keep this a nice place that folks want to use, and how to keep folks engaged, and learning the way that folks want to use this space to make it an even better option for them to get outside, to learn about nature, and to be physically active. So I just wanted to make sure we took a couple minutes there to share an example of how an agency has used this guidance to leverage it in community. And I'll note, like I said, these are not all perfect examples. And as you heard me say, emphasizing that partnership piece between public health and between Parks and Rec, we didn't see that as much in this particular example, but did just want to call out that they partnered really well with community, and also they partnered really well with the local school system, which was exciting. So we are excited to see this project grow and to see more folks get out in the space. I think we just had one more slide. Perfect. So just wanted to note again that when Park and Recreation and public health professionals are taking this guidance to implement different physical activity projects, it can support advancing health equity in communities. So making sure that every community member has access to those programs and those services and those places that are improving health outcomes and enhancing quality of life, like I said when we kicked off this presentation. And so again, just wanted to reiterate the importance of prioritizing those community members who have been historically excluded from park spaces and who have faced those barriers historically to accessing those spaces to improve the health of all individuals in communities. So I think we're about at time. Happy to drop our contact information in the chat. I'm going to drop a link to the Active Parks Guide in the chat as well, but would love to open it up to questions or comments. And I think I saw a question around how is access defined for measurement? And Dianne, I didn't know if that might be a question that you wanted to jump in on and maybe go into Esri or some of those tools that we're using.
Sure, one moment, let me just read the question. Sorry, having some technical difficulties.
Randy, you want to read the question if necessary?
Yeah, I was gonna say I can read it for you, Diane, if you can't find it.
Hey, I found it. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So defining access, I guess, we defined access, typically we define access as being, within a 10-minute walk from the park. And we try to incorporate that in most places unless they happen to not, that doesn't make any sense for them. So while I don't remember, honestly, if we actually defined that in the document, I'd have to look at it to be honest. That's typically how we at NRPA would define access. And then food is not wine. How do we know equity and inclusion of that? Same thing. We usually use Esri data to define the general composition of the community within a 10-minute walk, and then look at the demographics. And then if when you're performing any type of evaluation, you make sure that all those voices are represented in the data that you collect. Typically, I mean, I'm not sure we were, because we only had a short couple paragraphs to put in there, I'm not sure we were extremely explicit about that, and we kind of let equity be defined as contextually appropriate. But that's, what my idea is anyway on how it's defined.
Did that answer your question, Deborah? Your hands back up.
It answers it. Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah, it answers my question for the guide. But in the bigger scheme of things, I think that we could better consider access in the context of equity, because available is one thing and spatial access is one aspect of access. But what we know with diverse communities and diversity not necessarily easily understood in the context of community diversity, that there are groups who are limited in access by features other than a 10-minute walk. And if we don't begin to bring that conversation into how we make decisions about locating public spaces, parks and rec, what kinds of conditions of access need to be considered once the resource is made available, and who informs changing features to make it more accessible when parks are scheduled for improvements, particularly infrastructure improvements. Then we're going to continue to perpetuate this notion of, if it's close enough, everybody has access, and that is certainly not the case. So I wanted to hear that, because in doing health and place work and parks and recreation programs, including outdoor and indoor spaces and year-round access for the diversity of people, that is become really central to how we begin the conversation, right? And then expand that into whatever actions are taken to actually increase easy access. And I always use the word easy, easy access to public spaces for the diversity of people who really need and want access.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I just think that's kind of where we start, is looking at the characteristics of the community, but then, yeah, making sure that the transportation is there, that all the ADA requirements are there, that it's activated properly for the interests of the community, that type of thing. Of course, are all very important. Thank you for that comment.
Yeah, I see your hand up, so if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Oh, I was just going to reiterate what Deborah was saying. I completely agree, and that I think a lot more emphasis needs to be put on the activation side of things as part of the equity, and it should be on an equal footing as the ESRI and the geolocation data, to make sure that those things are working for people.
Yeah, even in the observational tools that are often used to determine who is accessing park spaces and what they're doing in the park, those tools are really based on what people see and what judgments they make about what's going on. And it's intended to be objective, but you have this strong subjectivity bias built into the tool itself, so like we need better tools in order to have better understanding of actually who is included in public spaces, park spaces, and how that resonates with the diversity of people who are using those spaces and those who are not, and why.
I just wanted to highlight a question that was asked during the presentation in chat from Jeanette Gassat, who said, who is the intended target audience for this guide? And Teresa responded with the intended audience is Parks and Recreation plus public health professionals. So just want to highlight that for anyone who didn't see it. Do we have any other questions here for our speakers?
I guess I have one, if you don't mind. Thank you for your presentation. This is really interesting and I think actionable, and looks like there's some good examples. Is there a plan to follow its distribution, see how it works, assess the plan itself, like how many people use it and what happens from that and any of that?
That's a great question. And that's sort of phase 2 that we're still trying to figure out with this resource. We're still in the rollout phase. And to your point, yeah, well, we want to know who's using it, what's working, what's not working. I'll just note that sometimes that phase 2 is dependent on funding, which we're always looking for. So we're figuring that out currently. And that's a great question.
Thank you.
All right, final call. Ask for any more questions here before we move on.
It looks like Vincente put some link in the, did you want to talk about that in the chat?
Hi, it's great to meet you all. Thank
Hi,
you for
welcome.
the invitation. Hello, I'm from Mexico. I'm really interested in what you're talking about. I think this is a great opportunity to share with you a model that we use about gender violence here in Mexico. I'm an economist, so everybody was like surprised that I use a mathematical model to prove that gender violence affects directly to economic development. So this model allows us to back up or theoretical stuff. So I would like to share it with you. I'm seeing a lot of perspectives here, so I'll be glad to share it with you. And I will have a question. My question would be, how did you get the financing to make this project self-sustaining? How did you do it? Because here in Mexico, we are always depending on the government. So people and citizens are always like, government should do it or government should pay for it. And here is very difficult for us to getting like funds besides that. So that will be my question. And thank you very much for the invitation. And I will thank you very much for your presentation as well. It was great. And I'm really glad to be here.
I'm
Well,
excited to dig into that resource that you dropped in there. I just wanted to note, and I welcome folks from this group to jump in as well. I think we see a similar situation in the park and recreation community of always struggling to get those funds for these projects so that they can have long-term impact, right? And so at NRPA, the way we're sort of thinking about that is that we're trying to build a shift in culture and the way that people are thinking about parks and recreation. So that slide I talked about around how parks and recreation is essential, like not everyone thinks of it in that way. So really trying to bring people along on this learning journey around realizing that parks and recreation and these, different organizations are really critical to making sure that community members have access to these services and programs that support their quality of life. So not something that happens overnight, unfortunately, but something that we're always trying to work on in our communications and sharing the work that our agencies in the field are doing, because yeah, I totally get that. Funding seems to always be a constraint. And it seems like whenever cities need to make cuts to their budgets, parks and recreation is the first to go, because people think of them as a nice to have and not as this really critical and essential infrastructure. So I appreciate you raising that point.
All right, well, if that's all the questions we have, again, I'd like to thank our speakers for their wonderful presentation. I will include their contact information in the follow-up email. So if anything comes up after this meeting, feel free to shoot them an email. We will, continue on here. So let me pull up my slides again. Go. All right. Does anyone have any updates on current projects that they're working on for PAPREN, or just any projects in general that they might be in a new stage where they could bring in new members for help. All right, sounds like there is none. I just wanted to give a quick Active Living Conference recap to everyone that was there. I hope you had a wonderful time. Hopefully we got to connect. There were about 250 people there, so it was a good conference, good size. You can see a few pictures that were posted here. We did different workshops. We had tons of different presentations from roundtables and individual speakers and different speed talks as well. But I would like to also just like highlight the role that PAPREN played as a partner in the conference. There were 18 PAPREN supported projects presented at this conference. And I think it was like 10 or so more presented by PAPREN people who were not PAPREN supported. But there was a very wide perspective of PAPREN here. And if anybody who was there besides me would like to jump in and kind of share an experience, we do have a minute or so here extra. If anybody wants to share something that they liked about the conference, if they were there. All right, Terry, I see you raised your hand. Go ahead.
I had a great time as always. What I wanted to comment was on how welcoming and exciting the meeting was for the undergraduate student I brought. Andy met Olivia. She had a wonderful time and just thought this was the coolest thing since sliced bread. Everyone, had lots of good questions, was very welcoming, and just so thank you everybody who was there. And I think everyone should think of this as a place to bring their students and start introducing them to the professional network.
Yeah, I want to highlight as a student who, when it was very fun to get to talk to professionals who are doing that practitioner side as well as that academic side and kind of see their perspectives and everything. Does anyone else want to share a quick comment about how the conference went for them if they were there? Someone else was really there. Kind of look. Deborah, you were there.
I was, yeah. It was as always, this is always a great conference, and I agree with, was that Terry, that it's always a really welcoming space for all of the people who have been there for a long time, been at this conference, been with this organization, been included, and all of the newcomers, the people who are new to the conference for the first time. So that was really as fun and exciting and great to connect with people that some of them I haven't seen in good grief 20 years in the bigger scheme of things at the Active Living Conference, to be clear. I will say that I was a little challenged by the NIH campus thing. I'm going to put that right out there. It's great to be welcomed onto the campus and supported by one of the NIH programs in part, and at the same time, it kind of makes your time at the conference a bit restricted. And that was my personal experience. And so I just wanted to say that it was kind of like, okay, this is good and, maybe challenging, good and challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. Good point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Like the food, the
food was a challenge.
Food, right? Yeah.
I don't understand. What was the issue with the food?
So there wasn't, the first day we were there was no food available for lunch. It was just coffee and water. And there's not a lot of food options on the campus. And I believe the two that were there were closed that day. But then the second and third day we did get lunch, and that was I thought it was good lunch, so I enjoyed it. But yeah, there was a little bit of difficulty, I think, with the infrastructure planning there, at least on the first day. So yeah, moving on here. I'm going to give a chance for an open mic here. We do have about 7 minutes, so a little bit of time here. Anybody wants to jump in and share any thoughts, literally anything that you would want to share about work you're doing, about projects you have coming up, if you need help with anything, celebrating something, anything that you would like to share, now would be your time here to share. And I just want to address Vincent's question really quick. He said, is there a summary document of this meeting? And yeah, I'll send out an email at the end tomorrow or the next day to get a summary going, as well as a recording to the meeting as well here. So that will be available. So anybody else who wants to jump in for an open mic, feel free to do so now.
Do we have any projects coming up?
I do. Yeah, this is Deborah. I have a project coming up, and actually I could I could use some suggestions. And I alluded to an observational tool to assess park use, users and activities in the park. And I'm working with students, mostly undergraduate students, but a couple of graduate students, to look at the park system in our community. And it kind of triggered out of a park renovation. So I'm going to be quickly very explicit. The name of the park a few years ago, probably 10 years ago, was assigned as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Park. The location of the park and the park at the time was a natural environment area that had nothing more than benches, trails, walking through the natural area, and some historic landmarks on the property. And so they're renovating the park. The city is renovating the park to align with justice principles in both environmental justice and Dr. Martin Luther King social justice. And the decisions that have been made relative to this park, including where the park is already located, I have been paying attention, because that whole notion of community engagement, the people who are engaged in informing the park renovation in the context of a whole park system are hand-selected by the city to represent who the city government believes are representative of people who would understand and align with social justice principles as Dr. Martin Luther King would have advanced those in the 60s. Right. So if you kind of listen to the underlying tone here, I mean, it's like decisions have been made, money has been raised by people who live in the community, but certainly not the most underrepresented voices in the community. The location of the park is in the most affluent neighborhood of the community, and the investment in that particular park is an investment that, if you look across the park system, so I have students who are kind of following this, and they're going to go out and do some observations pre and like now of all of the parks, who's using which parks and what are they using and why, across the city, not that big of a city, but across the city. And then hopefully we'll be able to look as the park relaunches in 18 months and track and see if the users change, or if it's just the same types of users using a much improved park space. So the question is the observational tool, which is a challenge in itself, and applying it across a whole parks and rec system, a government system that is not necessarily engaging the diversity of the community in informing investments across the city, right? So who lives where and who gets what is not necessarily part of the decision making. And that was kind of what I was thinking through the presentation. It's like this notion of community engagement often is not driven by the community as much as driven by the investor. You know, if we have certain people on the community advisory board, then we are representing the community, and I'm always conflicted with that, right? How do we measure who is using a park well? And how do we use that information without the underlying bias that's kind of inherent to how we understand diversity in our communities? And
Deborah, I'll give you a few words of advice here. And I mean, I think Jeanette and Rich have kind of gotten to this as well. We did observations and tried to observe race and ethnicity using the SOPARK form. I mean, there's no way to know for sure how valid our observations were, but we made sure our research assistants were diverse and representative of the neighborhoods in which we were conducting the SOPARK. And specifically, we were looking at Black neighborhoods, Hispanic Latinx neighborhoods, and Asian American neighborhoods. And so we made sure we had research assistants who either lived in the neighborhoods or identified with those race or ethnicities. I also agree with Rich's comment, though. I mean, it's observational, and it has never felt amazing, or I've never felt amazing or super confident with some of those results and some of those discussions. And having a survey, even as brief as possible, such that folks can self-identify to what race, ethnicity, or plural, is going to be way better. But I mean, I think associated with each of that is opening up this opportunity to the community as much as possible. So it's not just yourself or graduate students or even undergraduates collecting the data, that the community itself is able to collect the data, which I know can become challenging with recruiting and compensating, but that's going to be the best option, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. We are engaging the community, and unfortunately, in the context of a community like Corvallis, you know, the diversity of the community is not necessarily observable, and the neighborhoods are certainly not segregated in the majority of various racial or ethnic groups live in one neighborhood. I would say that neighborhood income is probably the most relevant condition that attracts whatever diversity there is in the community to affordable housing. And that, you know, understanding that's why I mentioned the nature of the neighborhood where this one park is located, because a park improvement in an area where, you know, the park is well used, and I'm going to make an assumption it's not going to be any better used once it's improved. Certainly not by the, you know, people who live across town in the lowest income areas that don't have a park. Yeah, they're not going to take the bus that doesn't come here to use a park that has been improved. But I was actually wondering if, and maybe this is, you know, we have amazing technologies now, and I would certainly like to see like park use technologies become more integrated, so that people don't have to self-identify anything other than who they are when they come into the park. It's by choice. But if we had this as kind of a standard practice, right, where you key in or you use a QR code or you do something else to basically say who you are, then tracking park use, time of park use, you know, distribution of who uses parks when, which we know is, you know, varies. might be something that, I mean, we're in a technology world, and tracking information, particularly if it's not identifiable to the actual person, could be a way that if we can do wayfaring in a park, we can certainly do some sort of tracking park users. So we've tried using QR codes in some of our trails to get information from folks. And what do y'all think about that?
Well, let's continue this conversation afterwards. I want to quickly just go through the finished slides here since we're at time, and then we'll go ahead and continue this afterwards. But just ever so quickly, our next meeting is going to be April 24th at the same time. We have Jason Wilkie coming from the Milwaukee Recreation Department. He's the manager of design and development, and he's going to be talking about their Dream Build Play project in Milwaukee. And then finally, just want to finish up with our April grand rounds here, which will be Monday, April 26th. That's not correct. That's not Monday, but it's April 26th for sure. And that's at noon Eastern as well. And Christian, who's one of the co-leaders of the Rural Active Living Group, is going to be talking about active physical activity in rural America, prevalence, promise, and partnerships. And advanced registration is required for that. Yeah, thank you. It's a Wednesday there. So Wednesday, April 26th. All right. I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. And again, if we want to continue.